My daddy kept a secret for 9 years. Not the bad kind, the kind that hurts too much to share. I found it in a shoebox under his bed when I was 8. I didn't tell him right away. I waited until he was ready. This is the story of how I knew when that was. The Grand Meridian Ballroom occupied the entire 4th floor of a building that had been telling people they didn't belong since 1924. Daniel Holt knew this because he had read the building's history in a library book 3 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon when Lily had been doing her homework at the next table. He had read about the original owner, a shipping magnate named Hargrove, who believed that architecture should communicate hierarchy without apology, and he had thought some things don't change much. Then he had returned the book to the shelf and gone back to watching Lily struggle with long division, and had not thought about it again until tonight, standing on the 4th floor with a maintenance cart and a microfiber cloth, listening to the building hum with preparations for the Mercer Arts Foundation annual gala. He was cleaning the Steinway Model D when he found the problem. His hands moved across the instrument with the kind of attention that didn't come from job training or procedural memory. It came from somewhere older than his current life, from the part of him that had spent 17 years learning to treat a piano not as furniture, but as a living system, 12,000 moving parts in constant relationship with each other, each one affecting every other, the whole thing vibrating with possibilities that only resolved into music when someone knew how to ask the right questions. He ran the cloth along the curve of the rim across the music desk, down the side of the cabinet toward the key slip. His calloused fingers, worn from 3 years of maintenance work at the Meridian, and before that, 2 years at a commercial property management company in Queens, moved with a precision that looked almost gentle. He pressed the D-sharp key in the upper register, let the note hang in the empty hall. Sharp. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register as wrong to 90% of listeners. 3 cents off from a 440 concert pitch. But he heard it the way he heard everything, completely, without the filters most people applied unconsciously to make the world more manageable. He had always heard this way. His mother had called it a gift when he was young. His professors at Juilliard had called it extraordinary. He had eventually stopped calling it anything because naming it meant thinking about it, and thinking about it meant thinking about everything he had done with it, and everything he had stopped doing, and that particular corridor of thought led somewhere he had spent 9 years learning to avoid. He filed the information away. The note was sharp. He would work around it tonight when the time came, if the time came, which it would not, because he was here to clean floors and check cable connections and make sure nobody tripped over a loose threshold strip in the dark, not to sit down at a Steinway Model D in a rented ballroom and play anything at all. He returned the cloth to his cart. The sound of voices and equipment carts preceded the arrival of the Gala setup team by about 4 minutes, which was enough time for Daniel to move to the edge of the stage and begin a systematic check of the cable runs along the floor. He worked with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to complete tasks before being redirected by people who had not been paying attention to what he was doing. His colleague Ray, 55 years old and 18 years into Meridian maintenance work, called it the invisible man's speed. You move fast enough that by the time they notice you were there, you're already somewhere else. Ray had told him this on his 3rd day, and Daniel had recognized the truth in it immediately. He had been practicing it in various forms since long before he started this job. He was checking the 3rd cable run near the stage left exit when he heard the small sound from the wings. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor behind the curtain with her sketchbook open on her knees, her pencil moving in the concentrated, slightly frowning way that meant she was trying to capture something before it shifted. She was 9 years old and wore her hair in a braid that had been neat at 7 that morning and was now conducting a slow rebellion against its own structure. His Old Navy hoodie swallowed her to mid-thigh. She had taken it from his closet 3 weeks ago, and he had not asked for it back. She had drawn him standing at the piano. Not as he had been standing slightly apart from the instrument, the cloth in his hand, the professional distance of a man doing a job. In Lily's drawing he was seated on the bench, his hands on the keys, and the piano was glowing slightly, which was not something pianos did in the real world, but was something Lily apparently believed pianos did when the right person was touching them. Daniel looked at the drawing for longer than he had intended. He looked at his own face in it. Lily had gotten the jaw right, the set of the eyes, the slight furrow between the brows that he had been told appeared when he was working through a problem, and he saw something there that he had not seen in his own reflection in 9 years. He could not immediately name what it was. He returned to his cable check. "You drew me playing," he said without looking up from the connector he was examining. "That's what you look like you want to do." He set down the connector and turned. Lily was still drawing, not looking at him. The pencil moved with certainty. "What do I usually look like when I want something? Like you're trying to want something else instead." She paused, considered the sketch. "When you want something you're not letting yourself have, you get very efficient. Like if you work fast enough, you can outrun it." He crossed to her and crouched down to her level, his back protesting mildly. The left knee had been giving him trouble since a slip on a wet floor in February. He looked at the drawing for another moment. "When did you get this smart?" "I've always been this smart. You just usually change the subject faster." He took the lunch container from his maintenance cart, turkey on wheat. No mustard, apple slices, the small bag of crackers she liked, and set it beside her without comment. She picked it up without looking away from the sketchbook. They had conducted approximately 4,000 versions of this exchange over the past 9 years. The specific words changing but the underlying structure constant. He provided something necessary without making it into a moment. She accepted it without making it into gratitude, and the air between them stayed clear. "Mrs. Patterson says artists are the people who notice what everyone else is too busy to see," Lily said, opening the container. "Mrs. Patterson's observant. She said real observation means you stay with something until it tells you the truth." She bit into the apple. "I've been watching you with that piano for 20 minutes. I was cleaning it. You were listening to it." Daniel stood and returned to the cable check. "Eat your dinner. They're going to start arriving soon and you need to stay in the wings." He could feel her watching his back as he moved away, that particular quality of attention she had fully present, taking in everything, not yet old enough to have learned how to pretend she wasn't watching. Sarah had looked at him that way sometimes, had watched him across rooms with that same quiet completeness as though he were something worth studying. He had spent 9 years learning to accept that nobody would ever look at him that way again, and then Lily had grown old enough for her eyes to hold that expression, and he had been entirely unprepared for what it did to him. The setup team arrived in force at 6:43. 17 people with rolling racks and equipment cases moving through the ballroom with the organized urgency of professionals who had built this particular world hundreds of times and knew exactly how long it would take and what would go wrong and where the problem areas were. Daniel stepped back into the professional distance that had served him across every room he had worked in since leaving the life that preceded this one. He became efficient. He became useful in small ways. He became, as Ray had taught him, appropriately invisible. His colleagues, Ray and Marcus, worked the floor with him, checking the lighting rig connections along the east wall and making sure the service entrance stayed clear of decorative overflow. Ray was 55 and had the particular stocky solidity of a man who had never wasted energy on anxiety and saw no reason to start. Marcus was 38, had a son named Charlie who was 7, and went to school 3 blocks from where Lily went, and was in the process of deciding whether his marriage was survivable. He had been conducting this process for the better part of a year in the form of occasional observations offered to Daniel and Ray that were clearly more useful to Marcus as a form of thinking aloud than as requests for advice. "Same circus," Ray said quietly, when the first guests began to appear, sweeping through the main entrance with that particular ease of people who had never had to think about whether a room like this was meant for them. "Don't say that in front of Lily. She's already drawn a picture of it, I guarantee." Daniel glanced toward the wings. Lily had moved slightly forward, her sketchbook against her chest, now her pencil working from a new angle. She was drawing a woman in a gown with a face that looked from this distance remarkably like a marionette caught mid-performance. He decided not to look more closely. The Mercer Arts Foundation Gala drew its guests from the particular stratum of New York society that believed culture was something you funded rather than experienced, or rather that funding it was itself a form of experience, the most refined form, the one that involved no inconvenient surrender to emotion. Daniel did not dislike these people. He had spent enough time in enough rooms to understand that most human behavior, regardless of the income bracket it occurred in, arose from the same combination of fear and desire and the specific confusion that resulted from not being able to tell them apart. What these guests feared and desired was simply expressed in a different vocabulary than what he feared and desired, and the vocabulary made them look from the outside like they had already solved problems that had not yet occurred to them. He was checking the threshold strip near the orchestra pit when the room shifted. It was not a visible shift. Nobody moved differently or spoke differently. But something in the air changed the way a room changes when someone walks in who has learned to make space reorganize itself around them without asking. Daniel had known 3 people in his life who had this quality. 2 of them had been music professors. The third had been a conductor who made orchestras sound like a single enormous instrument by standing very still and listening harder than anyone else in the room. Arthur Voss walked in with the air of a man who had decided long ago that his presence was the most significant thing in any room he entered and had found this assessment confirmed often enough to stop questioning it. He was 58, silver-haired, wearing a suit that fit the way only hand-tailored things fit, not expensively, just correctly, as though his body's proportions were the standard everything else was measured against. He wrote for 3 publications and sat on 6 boards, and had been for 30 years one of the people who decided which artistic endeavors in this city were worth taking seriously. Daniel had seen his photograph in newspaper arts sections enough times to recognize him without needing an introduction. What he had not expected was the quality of Voss's attention as it swept the room, not the social attention of someone cataloging guests and calculating positioning, something more specific than that. A small evaluating watchfulness that landed briefly on the piano on the stage setup on various corners of the room. And then for a fraction of a second that Daniel would not have been able to prove to anyone who hadn't been paying the same caliber of attention on Daniel himself. Not the usual seeing through of a man in a maintenance uniform. Something closer to recognition or its shadow, the sensation of a file being consulted and found incomplete. Then Voss turned to greet a board member who had materialized at his elbow, and Daniel returned to the threshold strip. "He looks like someone who grades people," Lily said from directly behind him. He turned. She had moved from the wings to the edge of the service corridor just within the acceptable perimeter he had established for her movements during events. "That's observant. He was looking at you like he was trying to remember something. People look at the staff sometimes. It doesn't mean anything." Lily's pencil scratched softly against her page. It looked like it meant something. He did not pursue this because a full examination of what Arthur Voss's look might have meant would require Daniel to think about the specific category of people who might recognize him in a context like this one, and that category existed and had names attached to it, and following those names led to places he had spent 9 years not going. He guided Lily back toward the wings, settled her in the corner near the service entrance with her sketchbook and the second half of her crackers, and returned to work. Caroline Mercer arrived at 6:13, 47 minutes before the scheduled start time, which was her standard operating procedure for every event her foundation hosted. She moved through the entrance with the compressed efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything faster than it needed to be done because moving at full speed left less time for the kind of thinking that cost her something. She was 46 and dressed in a way that communicated authority without requesting it. Dark fabric, precise fit, nothing superfluous. Her hair was pinned back with the no-nonsense arrangement of someone who had made a decision about her hair years ago and found no reason to revisit it. Daniel observed her for perhaps 3 seconds before she reached the stage, which was long enough to notice 2 things. The first was that she moved through this room the way a building inspector moves through a building, not as someone who belonged there, but as someone who was responsible for it, which was a different relationship with space and one he recognized. The second was what happened when she reached the piano. She stopped. Her right hand came up from her side, fingers extended, and moved toward the keyboard cover with the muscle memory of someone who had made this approach thousands of times. The hand crossed the 2 feet of air between her body and the instrument, and then, at a distance of perhaps an inch and a half from the surface, stopped. She held that position for 1 breath. 2. Then she withdrew her hand and turned toward her assistant, who was providing information about seating arrangements in a rapid undertone. Daniel had seen this gesture before. He had not seen it on anyone else. He had seen it on himself in the reflection of a piano's polished black surface standing in the living room of the apartment that was no longer his apartment 3 weeks after Sarah's funeral, the moment before he had understood with his body, rather than his mind, that he was not going to be able to play anymore. The way the hand reached, and then the hand understood something the brain had not yet formally processed, and the hand came back. She looked up. Across the stage, across the equipment carts and the focused movement of the setup team, her eyes met his with the direct measuring attention of someone who was genuinely looking rather than performing the social ritual of looking. He held her gaze for half a second. She looked away first. But there was something in the interval, something that was not yet anything, but that had the quality of a door left slightly open by someone who didn't want to be responsible for having opened it. He moved his cart toward the east wall. The Gala assembled itself with the specific momentum of events that have been run many times by competent people. The quartet materialized in the orchestra pit at 7:15 and ran through a tuning sequence with the professional brevity of musicians who respected each other's time. The bar stations were positioned and stocked. The centerpieces arrived from a florist service in a series of climate-controlled vans and were distributed across the tables by young people in black, who moved with an efficiency that Daniel respected. He worked the perimeter, collecting stray equipment cases, checking the cable runs twice more, straightening chairs that were already straight, because having something specific to do was the correct response to a room that was building towards something, and there was no other productive role available to him. Ray worked the west side of the floor. Marcus handled the service entrance rotation. Lily remained in her corner filling pages. It was during the cocktail hour, roughly 40 minutes after the main arrival, that Voss found him. He had seen the approach from across the room, the particular trajectory of a man with a destination who wanted the destination to appear casual. Daniel had been collecting a glass that someone had left on a window ledge and was making his return to the service corridor when Voss intersected his path near the orchestra pit, with the naturalness of a collision that had been planned. "Quite the production," Voss said. His voice had the resonant quality of someone who had used it professionally, reading for radio perhaps, or teaching, or simply speaking in rooms that required carrying power. "They do this every year." "Yes, sir." "And you've worked this room before?" "A few times." Voss turned slightly to observe the crowd, his champagne glass held at an angle that was precisely calculated to suggest relaxed social engagement. "The piano is a remarkable piece. You've been tending it carefully." "It deserves the attention." Something shifted in Voss's expression, not quite a frown, but a recalibration, the look of someone who had received a response that didn't fit the expected parameters. "You know something about it." "Enough." "How much is enough?" Daniel kept his voice even and his face professional. "Enough to know it needs attention, sir." Voss looked at him for a moment with the specific quality of a man who was accustomed to determining the value of things and had encountered an item whose value was not immediately legible. Then he smiled with the upper part of his face only. "Of course," he said. "The help usually does what it's trained for." He drifted away toward a cluster of board members, his movement carrying the satisfied ease of someone who had completed a small task. Daniel watched him go and felt nothing as sharp as anger. Anger required a certain investment in the other person's opinion, and he had long since stopped investing there. What he felt was something quieter and more durable, the specific fatigue of a man who had spent 9 years being accurately measured by the wrong instruments. "He has mean eyes," Lily said from his elbow. She had materialized beside him with the silent approach that she had developed over years of practice in rooms where children were supposed to be neither seen nor heard. Her sketchbook was open to a new page, and she had drawn Voss with a precision that was impressive and slightly unsettling. She had captured the upper face-only smile exactly. "Some people are mean. It's just how some people are." "Why, though mean is more work than regular?" You have to think about it." He guided her back toward the service corridor with one hand on her shoulder. Mean is what happens when someone is scared for long enough that they forget what they were scared of. The scared part stays, but they lose track of the reason, and it comes out sideways. What's he scared of? He thought about this honestly, which was what Lily's questions usually required. "I think he's scared that someone will figure out that his opinion is not the same thing as the truth." She considered this for a moment, then wrote something small in the margin of her sketchbook. He did not ask what it was. 40 minutes later, Voss took the microphone. Caroline Mercer had just completed her remarks, 8 minutes, no wasted words. The polished ease of someone who had delivered 100 variations of this speech and had long since stopped hearing the individual sentences, and the MC was moving toward the podium for the program announcements when Voss stepped forward from the left side of the stage with his champagne glass raised and the comfortable authority of a man who understood that timing was simply the art of moving before anyone thought to object. "Before we proceed," he said, and his voice filled the room with the ease of something that had been filling rooms for decades, "I wonder if we might have a small addition to the evening's entertainment." The room's attention organized itself toward him. This was the specific gravity of a person who had spent 30 years positioning themselves as the place where attention collected. Caroline Mercer stood at the side of the stage with an expression that had locked into professional neutrality so precisely that it communicated to anyone reading carefully that she was actively managing a response she had decided not to have publicly. Voss turned toward the service corridor with the theatrical precision of a man who had located his subject before he started speaking. "Our friend from building maintenance has been communing with the Steinway all evening with a devotion that I found quite touching. That level of dedication deserves recognition." His voice carried the tone of someone constructing a gift, generous, warm on the surface, the frame assembled around a trap. "I'm sure we'd all love to hear what he's learned from all that close attention. Something simple, perhaps. Something appropriate to the occasion." He raised his glass toward Daniel. "Twinkle? Twinkle, perhaps? Or something else that strikes your level?" The laughter came in waves, nervous at the edges, more confident in the middle, the specific sound of 300 people deciding in real time that this was the version of events they had been invited to endorse. Daniel stood at the edge of the service corridor and felt the spotlight find him with the inevitability of a thing that had been waiting all evening for permission to happen. Across the room near the far wall, Lily had risen from her corner. She was not crying. She was 9 years old and had her mother's specific form of fury, the kind that went very still rather than very loud, the kind that was more frightening than the loud kind because it meant the person had decided to actually deal with what was happening rather than simply react to it. She held her sketchbook against her chest with both arms, and she was looking at her father with an expression that he recognized from 9 years of being looked at by that face. She was not afraid for him. She was waiting for him. Caroline Mercer moved toward the microphone stand with the contained urgency of someone who had identified a fire and was moving toward the extinguisher, and Daniel understood in the half-second before she reached it that she was going to manage this, that she was very good at managing things, and that her management of this particular situation would be clean and professional, and would leave Arthur Voss feeling gently corrected, and would return the evening to its intended course, and that in 3 hours this room would have forgotten the maintenance worker by the piano, because the maintenance worker had been handled correctly and discreetly, and the gala had proceeded as planned. He thought about Sarah. Not the version of Sarah from the hospital, not the version of Sarah from the months before the earliest version, the one from before he knew how the story ended. The version who had watched him sit down at a piano in a practice room at Juilliard in 2000 and had leaned against the doorframe and said nothing for the full 12 minutes of the piece, and then said, "You play like someone who's been trying to apologize to the piano for existing. Stop apologizing. It doesn't need it, and neither do you." He was not invisible. He had never been invisible. He had been practicing invisibility for 9 years, because it was safer than the alternative. and the alternative was standing in a ballroom at the Meridian with 300 people watching, and the choice in front of him was the same choice it had always been: stay in the place he had been put or demonstrate that the place was wrong. He handed his cloth to Carolyn Mercer, who had just reached him, and he walked toward the stage. The laughter faded as he moved, not because anyone decided to stop, because something in his walk communicated that this was not the continuation of the joke. He took the 3 steps to the stage at a pace that was neither hurried nor deliberate, the pace of a man covering ground he had already decided to cover. Voss stood at the edge of the spotlight with his champagne glass and an expression that had recalibrated from predatory confidence to something more uncertain. He had expected Daniel to refuse or to comply with embarrassment, and neither of those options was what was happening. Daniel reached the piano bench. He sat down with the adjustment that was entirely automatic, the minute shift in position that seated the spine correctly over the hips, the angle of the wrists, the position of the feet, the adjustments that had lived in his muscle memory for 35 years and had apparently survived 9 years of disuse without significant deterioration. He looked at the keys. 88 of them, the entire range from the low A to the high C, the same instruments that had been here in various configurations since the first time someone had decided to map human feeling onto hammered strings. He had not sat in this position, this specific relationship between his body and an instrument, since the night after Sarah's funeral, when he had come home and sat at their piano and pressed a single note, and understood that this was not something he could do anymore, not right then, not while everything was as broken as it was. He had sold the piano 2 weeks later and told himself that someday was a real thing, and not a word people used to postpone the acknowledgement that they had decided to stop. The D-sharp was still sharp. He filed this away with a different part of his mind, the working part, the part that would account for this when the time came. He looked at Lily. She was at the edge of the stage now, her sketchbook held loosely at her side, and she was watching him with the complete attention that she had been watching him with all evening, and that he now understood had been the specific attention of a child who knew something was about to happen and had been waiting with the patience of someone who understood that waiting was also a form of trust. "Go ahead," Voss said from the edge of the spotlight, his voice having recovered some of its confidence. "We're all waiting." Daniel placed his hands on the keys. He did not play Twinkle, Twinkle. He played the opening bars of Samuel Barber's Piano Sonata, the first movement, the piece that had premiered at Carnegie Hall in 1949, and had been described by the Times critic at the time as the most important American piano composition of the century, a piece that required not years but decades of serious musicianship to execute correctly, a piece that nobody in this room tonight would have expected to emerge from the hands of a man in a maintenance uniform sitting at a Gala piano at 8:47 on a Thursday evening. The opening attacked with the ferocity that Barber had written into it, not a gentle introduction, but an immediate confrontation, the kind of opening that said, "Pay attention now, because I will not repeat this." Daniel's hands moved across the keys with the certainty of someone accessing memory that had not faded but had simply been in storage waiting for the combination that unlocked it. The muscle memory was intact. The technical capability was intact. What surprised him, and he registered this surprise in the part of his mind that was observing rather than performing, was that the emotional capacity was also intact, had apparently been in storage, alongside everything else, had been waiting in the same place with the same patience. He heard the room change. He did not see it, because his eyes were mostly on the keys and the brief territory of the instrument that required his visual attention. But he heard it, the specific acoustic shift of a space that has been full of ambient sound settling into genuine silence, which is a different thing. Ambient sound is the noise that people make when they are present but not listening. Genuine silence is what happens when the same people decide collectively and without coordination that something is more important than whatever they were doing instead. Voss's champagne glass was set on the nearest surface. He did not appear to have made a conscious decision to do this. Caroline Mercer stood at the side of the stage with both hands, still the cloth he had handed her, in her right hand, her left hand at her side, her face doing something that it had not done all evening. Her professional composure was still present, but it had become transparent the way a window is present, but allows you to see through it to something behind it. Lily was not drawing. She was standing at the edge of the stage with her arms at her sides and her face open in a way that 9-year-old faces are open when they forget to be anything other than what they are. And the thing she was a child watching her father remember who he had been before she was old enough to know him. Daniel played through the first movement's development with the attention of someone who had not forgotten the architecture of the piece, the way Barber had built tension through accumulation rather than assertion, the way the lyrical middle section was not a respite but a preparation, the way the whole thing was constructed as an argument that American music could hold everything that European music held and had room left over for something that did not have a European name. He played the D sharp, where it appeared in the upper register with a slight technical accommodation that nobody in the room would have noticed, a fractional adjustment in touch that compensated for the instrument's tuning variance and let the passage land where it was supposed to land. When the first movement concluded with the controlled violence of its final bars, Daniel lifted his hands from the keys. The silence lasted 4 seconds. He counted them because he needed something to do with the part of his mind that was not still inside the music. Lily began to clap. Her hands were small, and the sound was small, and it was the most specific and intentional sound in the room because it was the sound of someone who had been waiting 9 years for permission to make it. Caroline Mercer's hands came together a half-second later, not the measured applause of a foundation CEO acknowledging a performance, but the involuntary response of a person who has been moved and cannot locate a reason to pretend otherwise. The rest of the room followed in the way rooms follow when the first 2 people have established that this is what is happening now. People stood, not all at once, but in the progressive way that standing ovations actually work, from people who cannot help it first, then from people who see those people standing and recognize the impulse and stop resisting it, then from people who decide that remaining seated is a statement they don't want to be making. Daniel did not bow. He sat at the piano for a moment more, not performing stillness, but actually still in the specific way of someone who is coming back from somewhere and needs a moment to complete the return. Then he rose from the bench and walked to the edge of the stage where his cloth was sitting in Caroline Mercer's hand, and he picked it up. He was aware that this was visible. He was aware that picking up the cleaning cloth after what had just happened was a statement the same way putting it down to walk to the piano had been a statement. He was also aware that it was simply accurate. He was a man who worked in building maintenance and the cloth was his, and accuracy was something he had tried to maintain even in the years when he was performing a version of himself that left out most of the relevant information. He descended the 3 steps from the stage. Lily was at the bottom, and she didn't throw herself at him or cry or do any of the things that would have made a scene. She took his free hand in both of hers and held it, which was the version of all of those things compressed into something that could exist in a ballroom without requiring anyone else to accommodate it. "That was Mom's kind of peace," she said quietly. "Something that doesn't apologize for being what it is." He looked at his daughter. 9 years old, and she carried her mother the way rivers carry rainfall. You couldn't see the original water anymore, but it was entirely responsible for the current shape of everything. His throat did something that he decided to address later. Before he could respond, Caroline Mercer was beside him. Not in the way of someone who had crossed a room purposefully, but in the way of someone who had arrived without having made a decision to move. Her face had not yet fully recovered its working composure. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who is revising a large set of assumptions very quickly. "Where did you train?" Her voice was controlled, but not its usual controlled. It had the texture of someone asking a question they already know is going to rearrange something. "A long time ago." "That is not an answer." "Juilliard, class of 2001. A beat. "Edward Nakamura's studio." He looked at her more carefully. "You know his work." "I know everyone who came out of that studio in those years. He sent me a letter in 2002 about a student he called the most naturally gifted pianist he had encountered in 30 years of teaching." She held his gaze steadily. He described hands that understood the architecture of music rather than the execution of it. I kept the letter. A pause that had weight in it. My office. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. I have a shift at 8. I called your supervisor at 6:15. Your morning is clear. She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked back into the room where donors were already moving toward her with the purposeful momentum of people who have witnessed something unexpected and need a senior person to help them process its implications. Daniel stood at the bottom of the stage steps with his cleaning cloth and his daughter's hand, and the particular feeling of a man who had spent 9 years building walls that had just discovered one of them was a door. Ray appeared at his shoulder with the quiet arrival of a man who had learned that the most useful thing you could do in most situations was show up and not make a big deal of it. He looked at Daniel for a moment, then he looked at Lily, then he looked at the stage. "You want to tell me," Ray said, "why in 3 years of working with you the Juilliard thing never came up? It didn't seem relevant? It seems a little relevant now." Daniel looked at the stage once more at the piano sitting there in the middle of it. 12,000 moving parts, still settling back toward stillness after what had just been asked of them. "It didn't used to be mine anymore," he said. "I'm not sure what it is now." Ray considered this with the patience of a man who had been alive long enough to understand that some statements required consideration rather than response. "Go home," he said finally. "Take care of the kid. Get some sleep. Figure out the rest of it tomorrow." It was Lily, as they moved toward the service exit, who stopped him for a moment with the slight pressure of her hand in his. She was looking back at the stage with an expression that was difficult to read, a mixture of things that he thought he recognized, though he was not certain he was reading them correctly. "She heard it," Lily said. She was not talking about Caroline Mercer or anyone else in the ballroom. He did not ask who. He already knew. They left through the service exit the way they had come in. The hallway was quiet and fluorescent lit and smelled like floor cleaner and the specific neutrality of institutional spaces. And as they walked toward the elevator, Daniel realized that he was still carrying the notebook in the interior pocket of his uniform jacket, the worn leather notebook that he had carried to work that morning without quite understanding why, that he had carried for 9 years without opening, in which 47 measures of an unfinished piece of music waited with the patience of things that have nowhere else to go. The elevator doors opened. Lily walked in, still holding his hand. He followed. On the train home, she fell asleep against his shoulder in the way she had been falling asleep against his shoulder since she was 3 months old, and he had learned to ride public transit with an infant secured against his chest and his hands free in case something happened. He looked at her sketchbook, which had fallen open on her lap, to the last drawing she had made before the evening changed. It was a drawing of him at the piano. Behind him, rendered in soft pencil, was a shape that was not quite there, and not quite not there, the outline of a woman listening. He recognized the posture before he recognized anything else about it. He looked out the train window at the dark tunnel moving past. The notebook was still in his pocket. He had not opened it in 9 years. He had moved it from apartment to apartment, had carried it through the worst of everything, and the long plane of everything after had given it the specific consideration you give an object that is too important to lose and too painful to examine. He thought about what tomorrow morning was going to require of him. He was not afraid. He was something more precise than afraid. He was the way you feel standing at the edge of something when you have decided to step forward, but your body is still registering the information about the drop. Present and committed and aware that the next part was going to ask more from him than he had been asked to give in a very long time. The train emerged from the tunnel into the night air of Queens, and the city spread out around them in all its undiscriminating noise and light, and Daniel Holt sat with his sleeping daughter and his old notebook, and the specific feeling of a life that had, without asking his permission, decided to resume. He did not sleep. This apartment was 1,100 square feet in a building that had been constructed in 1962 and maintained with the specific level of attention that kept things functional without ever quite addressing the underlying issues. The radiator that knocked twice before settling the window in the kitchen, that admitted a thin draft at the lower left corner from October through March, the floor in the hallway between the two bedrooms that had a soft spot 3 inches from the baseboard that registered every footstep after midnight. Daniel knew every one of these sounds the way you know the particular vocabulary of a place you have lived in long enough to stop hearing it consciously. They were the sounds of his life continuing, which on most nights was comfort enough. Tonight they were just sounds. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and let his mind work through what it needed to work through without trying to direct it. This was a skill he had developed in the years after Sarah, the ability to hold a feeling at a slight distance, not suppressing it, not drowning in it, just maintaining enough separation to observe what it was doing. The therapist he had seen for 8 months, beginning 6 weeks after Sarah's death, had told him this was a healthy adaptation. He had accepted the characterization and stopped going to therapy when Lily's needs had outpaced both his schedule and his income's ability to accommodate it, and the skill had remained after the appointments ended, which he supposed was the point. What he was feeling was not grief exactly, or not only grief. It was the particular disorientation of a man who had spent 9 years organizing his life around an absence and had then spent 3 hours in a room where the absence briefly had a presence again and was now lying in his apartment at 3:47 in the morning trying to understand what the reorganization was going to require. He got up. The floor in the hallway registered his footsteps. He moved to the kitchen, put water on for coffee, and sat at the small table that occupied the corner under the window with the draft. The leather notebook was on the table. He had placed it there before getting into bed and had not touched it since, which was itself a relationship. The presence of the thing in his peripheral vision for 4 hours, the ongoing decision not to open it, which was also a form of attention. He opened it. The pages had the texture of paper that had been handled a great deal and then not handled at all, which was a specific texture worn at the edges where fingers had turned pages, but the surface itself preserved the ink still clear. His handwriting from 23 years ago looked like his handwriting now, except younger, which was not a quality he had expected handwriting to have. The notes he had made in the margins were still legible dynamic markings, tempo adjustments, structural notes about the harmonic relationship between sections, the annotations of someone who had been working seriously on something and had expected to continue working on it. The piece was called Lily's Lullaby in the header, written in the careful block letters he had used for titles. Beneath it, in smaller script for the one who's coming. He had written this 3 weeks before Lily was born, in the week when Sarah had started to talk less about the delivery and more about the things she wanted Lily to know, as though she were preparing for a journey and wanted to make sure the important things were documented before she left. He had not understood at the time that she was preparing for a journey. He read through 47 measures of music that he had set down and walked away from and not returned to. He did not play them. He ran his eyes across the notation and heard them in the interior acoustic of a mind that had never lost the ability to translate marks on paper into sound, even when it had stopped generating the sound externally. The piece was a lullaby in structure, gentle in its opening, but it had been building toward something in those 47 measures, reaching toward a resolution he had not yet found when he set the notebook down for what he had told himself was the last time. The water boiled. He made coffee and sat with it and the notebook and the 4-inch draft from the window and tried to hear in his mind what the piece wanted to become. He could not hear the ending. The 48 measure existed in him somewhere. He had felt it briefly at the Meridian tonight, the sense that the thing had a shape he hadn't yet mapped but could feel the outline of. But he could not bring it into focus at 3:47 in the morning in his kitchen, and he recognized that forcing this was the wrong approach, that the piece would come when it was ready and not before. Sarah had told him this about his compositions back when he had been finishing things regularly and had enough of them completed to understand the pattern. Some pieces know what they are immediately. Others need to wait until you've lived enough to understand what they're saying. He had lived enough. He was not sure he had finished the waiting. He closed the notebook and finished his coffee and sat with the draft until the light outside the kitchen window began to shift from the blue-black of full night toward the gray that preceded dawn. Then he checked on Lily, sleeping on her side with one arm extended as though reaching for something in her dream. The sketchbook on the nightstand beside her opened to the drawing with the shape behind him, and he returned to bed and lay there until his alarm went off at 6:45. The Mercer Arts Foundation occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown that had been built in the early 2000s when architects were exploring the idea that transparency was a value rather than just a material property. The lobby was all light and sight lines, the kind of space that made you visible from every direction simultaneously. Daniel arrived at 9:52 in the jeans that were his cleanest pair and the button-down shirt that had been ironed at some point in the past 6 months and had held most of its shape. He had considered this question of what to wear with more attention than he had given his appearance in years, and had arrived at the conclusion that wearing anything other than what he actually owned would be a kind of dishonesty that the morning did not have room for. The elevator opened directly into the Foundation's reception area on the 38th floor. The assistant, a woman named Diane, who moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to match her boss's pace or fall behind it, collected him from the lobby and walked him toward the corner office with the specific professionalism of someone who was not going to acknowledge that this situation was unusual. Caroline Mercer was standing at the window when Daniel entered. Not looking out, looking at. There was a difference that he had learned to read in the particular quality of stillness that people adopted when they were genuinely seeing something versus when they were performing the posture of someone who was. She was looking at the city with the attention of a person reviewing a situation they are responsible for. The room contained a baby grand piano in the corner that he had not expected, which was a thing he reflected on briefly, that he had spent enough time in spaces that contained pianos that his mind had an automatic expectation about whether a given room would have one, and in this case the expectation had been wrong. The piano was a 1952 Steinway B. He could date it from across the room by the cabinet design. It had not been touched recently. The bench was pushed slightly too far back, and the key cover was closed in the particular way of an instrument that has been closed for a long time. She turned from the window when he entered, and the professional composure was in place but differently than the night before. The previous evening it had been a working surface, smooth and operational. This morning it was more deliberately constructed, which meant the situation underneath it was less settled than she wanted it to be. She gestured toward the chairs arranged near the window, and they sat across from each other with the city behind her and the piano visible in his peripheral vision. "I looked at your record after you left last night," she said. The directness was not aggressive. It was the efficiency of someone who considered clarity a form of respect. Not the maintenance record, the other one, Juilliard 2001, Nakamura's studio. "You were invited to debut with the Philharmonic in December of that year. You withdrew from the program in November." A pause that held the specific weight of a question that has decided to take the form of a statement. "Your wife died in March of that year." "October," he said. "She died in October." A moment in which Caroline received this correction and adjusted. "I had the wrong month. I apologize. The withdrawal was in November. She died in October, and by November I understood that the debut wasn't going to happen." He kept his voice even. He had said these words in various forms over 9 years, and the saying of them had never become routine, but had become at least something he could do without losing the thread of the conversation. "After that I worked. I needed to work. Lily needed a roof and food and someone who was present rather than someone who was managing a grief and a career simultaneously. I chose the one that was more urgent. And the music. I set it down. I intended to pick it back up. I got used to it being down." Caroline was quiet for a moment with the consideration of someone processing a statement that requires re-examination. "I've been running this foundation for 12 years, she said. "I've seen hundreds of musicians in that time. Funded orchestras, solo careers, chamber ensembles, competitions, residencies. I have a reasonably accurate sense of what talent looks like and how common it is at various levels." She paused. "What you did last night is not something I see commonly. In 12 years I have seen it 3 times. 2 of those 3 times were in Carnegie Hall. Daniel looked at her steadily. I'm not auditioning. I know you're not. I'm providing context for what I'm about to ask. She shifted slightly in her chair, the first physical indication of something less than absolute confidence that he had seen from her. I want to fund a program. Not a competition, not a performance series, not a fellowship for existing professionals. A teaching program. For people who have been told or have come to believe that music was not meant for them. She met his eyes. Veterans who can't hold instruments steadily anymore. Single parents who can't afford lessons. Teenagers who have been placed in academic tracks that have no room for music. Adults who learned something 30 years ago and put it down because life didn't leave space for it. A small pause. People who set something down and got used to it being down. He recognized what she was doing with that last sentence. He let it sit in the room without responding to it. I want you to run it, she said. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when a statement is large enough to require a moment before the conversation can proceed. I'm a maintenance worker, he said. You're a Juilliard-trained pianist with a gift for the architecture of music rather than its performance, and last night you made 300 functionally impervious people cry in 4 minutes. I know what I'm asking for. He stood and walked to the window, which was not a dramatic gesture, but a practical one he needed to move, and the window gave him somewhere to look that was not at her. The city spread below in its working-day density. 6 million people engaged in the specific business of their lives, the whole thing operating with the organized chaos of a system that was too complicated for any single point to be responsible for. He had felt at home in it for 9 years, in a way he had never felt at home in the more deliberate world of professional music, where the complexity was organized by reputation and competition and the specific violence of artistic hierarchies. Who makes curriculum decisions? He said to the window. You do. If a donor wants something I don't think serves the students. She was quiet for a moment. You come to me first. I handle the donor. If it comes down to the program's mission versus a donor's preference, we lose the donor. He turned from the window. You'd lose funding over that. I've done it twice. It's not the decision that keeps me up at night. She met his gaze with the particular steadiness of someone telling the truth about something they've tested. The decisions that keep me up at night are the ones where I wasn't clear enough about what the work actually was, and I let someone fund their version of it instead of the real thing. He looked at the piano in the corner, the closed key cover, the bench pushed slightly too far back. He thought about what it cost to keep a thing you couldn't bring yourself to use, the specific tax of maintaining the presence of an absence, paying its rent in the household of your life while refusing to let it do its work. Why do you keep it? He said. She followed his gaze to the piano and did not pretend not to understand the question. The same reason people keep anything they're not ready to let go of and not ready to return to. What happened? A pause that was longer than her usual pauses. I was 16. Regional competition. McDowell's To a Wild Rose. The piece my first teacher gave me at age 7, the one I played at every competition until the year I placed second, and my mother stopped speaking to me for 3 weeks. Not for the placing, for the way I cried afterward in the parking lot where she could see me. Her voice stayed level, but the levelness was a choice. She said that precision without emotion was what music required, and I had the problem backward, that caring too much was the deficiency. She was wrong. I know that now. I knew it then, actually, but knowing something and being able to act as though you know it are different skills. She looked at the piano for a moment more. I stopped playing. I built this instead an entire professional life dedicated to music that I fund and administer and evaluate and never touch. For 12 years I've told myself this was a form of engagement. A pause. Last night was the first time I was certain it wasn't. He returned to his chair. What makes you think I can teach people who've never played? My training was classical. My background is in concert performance and composition. I've never run a program. You talked to your daughter for 9 years before you ever touched a piano again, and she knew things about you and music that people who have watched you perform would not have known. That is a form of teaching. She held his gaze. And you heard that D sharp at concert pitch from 20 feet away in a room full of ambient noise. You don't need a teaching certificate. You need students. He was quiet for a moment. I need to think about it. I know. And I need to talk to Lily. This affects her schedule, her routine. She has a say. Something in Caroline's expression shifted in a way he couldn't immediately categorize. Not surprise, but something adjacent to it, the look of a person encountering a behavior they had not expected and were adjusting their picture to accommodate. Of course, she said. Take the time you need. He stood to go. At the door he turned. The piano in the corner. McDowell, that's what you associate with the competition. She looked at the instrument. Among other things. You don't have to make a decision about it today either, he said, and left before she could respond. He picked Lily up from school 2 hours early. He had called ahead, and the school had been professionally discreet about it, which he appreciated. She came out the front door with her backpack and her sketchbook and the particular expression of a child who has been told a parent is coming early and has spent the intervening time deciding whether this is good news or bad news and has not reached a conclusion. He waited until they were seated on a bench in the small park 3 blocks from school, the one with the 2 oak trees that Lily had been climbing since she was 5 and was now technically too old for, but still attempted when she thought he wasn't watching. He waited until she had extracted her sketchbook and opened to a fresh page, which was her way of preparing to receive important information. The act of drawing while listening allowed her to be fully present without the social discomfort of full eye contact during difficult conversations. There's something I want to tell you, he said. About the piano. About everything. She looked up from the blank page, pencil poised. I'm listening. He told her about Juilliard, about Nakamura's studio and the scholarship and the years of training and what it had felt like to be 23 years old and understand for the first time that this was not just something he was good at, but something he was meant for. He told her about meeting Sarah at a jazz venue in the village in 1998, how she had been there with friends and had been the only person at the table who hadn't talked during the performance, how he had noticed her noticing the music in the same way he was noticing it and had found a reason to be introduced. He told her about the morning he had sat down to finish a composition he had been working on for 2 weeks and had found it complete, the whole thing present in his hands, and had played it through twice before realizing that Sarah was standing in the kitchen doorway in her socks, listening with her eyes closed, and he had felt in that moment that he understood why people wrote music. He did not tell her the details of the October that followed. She was 9 years old, and she knew the outline that her mother had died the night she was born, that it had been sudden in the final hours, though not without some warning in the preceding weeks that Daniel had been there and had held Sarah and had held Lily and had been present for both beginnings and endings within the span of 4 hours. He had told Lily this much when she was 7 and had asked with the directness that was her most fundamental characteristic, "Dad, how did Mom die?" He had answered fully and without evasion, because he believed children were owed accurate information about the circumstances of their own existence. But the texture of those hours, what it had cost him, what it had broken the specific quality of the silence in the hospital room, after that was his to carry for now, and he carried it. He told her about Caroline Mercer's offer. He told her about the chapel on West 47th Street and the abandoned music school and the piano that had been sitting there for 7 years waiting for someone to have a use for it. He told her what the program was meant to be and why Caroline believed he was the right person to run it, and he told her that he did not know if she was right, but that he was considering it seriously. Lily had been drawing throughout this, her pencil moving in the concentrated way that meant she was processing rather than simply transcribing. When he finished, she looked at her page. She had drawn him at the park bench not as he was sitting, but as he had looked at Juilliard, 23 years old, which she had never seen, which meant she had drawn him the way she imagined he must have looked younger, less careful, hands open instead of folded. Beside him, barely sketched, was a figure that was Sarah's shape. She had drawn this from the one photograph he had on the shelf, the one from 2 months before Lily was born. "Are you scared?" she asked. Yes. Good. She considered the drawing. Mom said in one of the other letters, I looked at them all, Dad. I should tell you that I didn't read them, but I looked at which ones were there. She said that being scared means you're paying attention, that the only things worth doing are the ones that make your hands shake. He was very still. What letters? She reached into her backpack. He had not seen her do this particular kind of preparation before, the deliberate, careful movement of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has decided that the holding is finished. The shoebox was small, the kind that had held a pair of athletic shoes and had been repurposed for storage. The ribbon was blue and had faded to the specific blue of something that had been stored rather than used. She placed it on the bench between them with both hands, the way you place something fragile. I found it a year ago, she said, behind your winter coats in the hall closet. There was a shoebox and inside were envelopes, and on the outside of each one she wrote who it was for and when to open it. She met his eyes steadily. The one on top said, Daniel, for when he's ready to play again. I read one to see if I should tell you. Then I waited. He did not touch the box immediately. He sat with it between them and breathed. How long did you carry this? 1 year and 4 days. He picked up the box with both hands. It was lighter than he expected, which made sense. Paper was not heavy. The ribbon was tied in a knot rather than a bow, which was Sarah's practical approach to things that needed to stay closed. He pulled the ribbon loose and opened the box. 7 envelopes, each one labeled in Sarah's handwriting, the neat, slightly right-leaning script that he had been seeing in his mind's eye for 9 years whenever he tried to remember what her handwriting looked like, and had here suddenly in front of him, real and specific and more itself than memory had been able to preserve. He picked up the one on top, addressed to him with the note for when he's ready to play again. He opened it. Sarah had written it in the hospital during the week before Lily was born. He knew this because she dated her letters from force of habit. The date was in the upper right corner, as though this were correspondence rather than a letter she expected to be read years after she was gone. The paper was light blue, her preferred color. The pen was the black rollerball she had kept on her desk. He knew the pen because he still had it. He had not known why he kept it. It had simply remained in his desk drawer through every move, and now he understood. Daniel, if you're reading this, our daughter decided you were ready. Trust her. She has your stubbornness and my timing, which means she's almost certainly right about when you needed to hear this. I need you to stop thinking that playing again is a betrayal. It isn't, and I think on some level you already know this, but knowing and acting are different things. And you have always needed someone to say the true thing out loud before you could let yourself act on it. So here it is. The music was never mine to take with me. It lived in you long before you met me. I was lucky enough to be the person who got to hear it every day, and that luck was mine, not something I gave you. Every song you play is a conversation I get to hear. Every student you teach is someone I get to meet through you. That's not moving on. That's how love continues when it doesn't get to finish the way it was supposed to. You are the best father I could have imagined for our girl. Don't let her grow up watching you disappear into yourself. She deserves the whole of you. Play, not for me, for the man you were before grief taught you to apologize for existing. I'll be listening. I always will be. Sarah. He read it twice. The second time the words were the same as the first time, which was both obvious and somehow a relief. He had been afraid that the second reading would be different, that he had misread something, that the thing he had understood was not what the words actually said. It was what they said. She had said it exactly in the handwriting he knew on the paper he recognized in the specific voice that was hers and no one else's. He sat on the park bench in the October afternoon and let himself feel what he felt without trying to manage it or observe it from a distance. This lasted for a specific amount of time that he did not measure. Lily sat beside him close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, drawing in her sketchbook without looking at the page, and he understood that she had known when she handed him the box that this was how this would go and had positioned herself accordingly. When he could speak, "How did you know today was the right day?" She looked at her drawing. She had been drawing the park, the trees, the bench, the two of them seen from above, as though a bird were observing. In the sky of the drawing, very faint, barely visible, she had sketched something that might have been clouds or might have been the outline of a figure listening from a height. "Because last night you played for the first time in 9 years and you didn't fall apart," she said. "You played and you came home and you got up this morning. That's what ready looks like. Not scared, just able to keep moving." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him with the complete ease of someone who has never questioned whether they were wanted in the space they occupied. "I'm going to take the job," he said. "I know. I've been designing the logo for 3 months. He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere below the chest, the involuntary kind that had been less frequent in the past 9 years than it had been in the years before, and whose absence he had not properly registered until its presence startled him. "Of course you have. Do you want to see it? Show me." The chapel on West 47th Street had been empty for 7 years before Caroline acquired it for the foundation's property portfolio. It was 3 blocks from 8th Avenue in a part of Midtown that had been gradually shifting from industrial to mixed use over the previous decade, the kind of neighborhood that still had a hardware store and a dry cleaner alongside a coffee shop that had opened 18 months ago and a gallery that had been there for 30 years. The chapel itself was a narrow 3-story building from 1908 stone facade, arched windows that had been boarded from the inside, a wooden door that had been repainted a color that might have been red once and was now brown from weather. Daniel arrived with his maintenance kit on the first morning and spent 4 hours working through the building's systems before he touched anything else. The electrical panel was a 1960s retrofit that had been competently done and was currently functional. The plumbing had 1 slow drain on the 2nd floor that would need attention within the year. The boiler was old but sound. The roof had been replaced 7 years ago and was in reasonable condition. The baby grand in the center of the main space, a 1968 Yamaha C3 that someone had donated when the music school closed, was dusty and slightly out of tune, but structurally intact, the soundboard without cracks, the action stiff from disuse but responsive. He tuned it first before doing anything else. Caroline arrived while he was on the 2nd hour of the renovation work she had given him 2 weeks before the program was supposed to begin accepting students, which was either aggressive or realistic depending on how you looked at it, and he had decided to look at it as realistic and work accordingly. She stood in the entrance of the main space and watched him working for a moment before he acknowledged her presence. "It's better than I expected," she said. The composure was firmly in place today, the CEO, rather than the woman he had spoken with 2 days earlier at the window overlooking the city. "The bones are good. 2 weeks is enough if I have help." He set down the paintbrush he had been using on the back wall. "I want to talk about the disagreement we're going to have." She looked at him directly. "Which one?" "Student selection. You're going to want some kind of application process. Screening. Something that gives the board a sense of quality control." "I was going to suggest a brief intake interview." "No." He had thought about this through 2 days of preparation, and the decision was clear. An intake interview is a gate. The people who need this the most are the ones who have been told their whole lives that they don't qualify for things. They won't come through a gate. They'll decide before they reach it that they don't belong on the other side. Caroline's jaw set slightly. "The board will ask how we ensure the program is serving the right population." "The right population is whoever shows up. If someone walks through that door, that's the qualification." He kept his voice even but did not soften the position. "This is the thing I won't move on. Everything else, curriculum, schedule, space usage, how we document outcomes, I'll work with you on all of it. But the door stays open." The silence in the chapel had the specific quality of silence in large stone spaces, fuller than ordinary silence, as though the stone had opinions it was holding back. "2 conditions," she said. "First, we document every student, not for gatekeeping, for impact reporting to funders. Names, brief backgrounds, what they work on. Second, you give me a monthly update on how the program is functioning so I can answer questions from the board without calling you every time someone asks." "Those are reasonable." "I know they're reasonable. That's why I'm offering them instead of the intake interview." He looked at her for a moment. "You're good at this." I've had 12 years of practice at finding the middle of an argument where both sides can stand. A pause. I'm not always right about where the middle is. You'll tell me when I placed it wrong. I will. The first students arrived on a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after the Mercer Gala. Daniel had not advertised in the way foundations usually advertise things. There had been no press release, no social media campaign, no glossy postcard. He had put a handwritten sign in the window of the chapel, and another at the community board of the public library 4 blocks away, and a third at the Veterans Services office in Queens that Ray had told him about. He had told 3 people personally, a woman he had seen at the laundromat, reading a sheet music book she had checked out from the library, a man in his 60s who sat on a bench near the Meridian every Tuesday afternoon with a harmonica he played quietly when he thought nobody was listening, and a teenager named Kevin who worked at the deli on the corner and had told him once when Daniel had come in for coffee on a slow morning that he had taught himself 4 chords on a YouTube guitar tutorial, and then his family had moved and the guitar had gotten left behind in the move, and he hadn't replaced it because it felt like starting over. None of these 3 came to the first Tuesday. 4 other people did. Thomas Reeves arrived first at 6:55 for a 7 o'clock start time, which was the punctuality of someone who had spent years in environments where being late had consequences. He was 63 years old, heavy-set with the specific economy of movement that people develop when they've learned to manage physical difficulty without advertising it. His hands rested on his thighs when he sat, and he did not hold anything, no phone, no bag. He had come from Queens on the subway, and he had come alone. "My daughter signed me up," he said when Daniel introduced himself. His voice had the flat, weathered quality of a man who had spent a long time not talking about important things. "I told her it was a waste of time." "Why did you come anyway?" Thomas looked at the piano. "Because she's usually right." Maria Santos arrived at 7 on the minute with the slightly breathless quality of someone who had been running since 5 in the morning and had not stopped. She was 38 and had 4 children and worked 2 jobs and had changed out of her hotel housekeeping uniform in the bathroom of the 42nd Street subway station, which Daniel knew because the uniform was partially visible in the bag over her shoulder. She apologized when she walked in for being exactly on time, which she framed as almost late, and then apologized for apologizing. And Daniel made a note that the first thing he was going to work on with her was the apologizing. David Park came with his mother, who left after making eye contact with Daniel with the specific communicative brevity of a parent conveying, "Here is my son, he is worth the trouble, please be patient." David was 17, tall with the slight inward angle of someone who had spent years trying to take up less space than his height naturally claimed. He sat at the far end of the room from the piano and looked at it the way some people look at dogs they want to approach but don't entirely trust yet. Grace Holloway was 71 and had been brought by her daughter, Jennifer, who sat in the back row with the folded hands of someone managing a complicated mix of hope and grief. Grace had Alzheimer's in its early stages, which Jennifer had told Daniel on the phone the previous week, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to give medical information without the emotional overlay that made people treat her mother as a diagnosis rather than a person. Grace sat in the front row and looked around the chapel with the bright, present attention of someone who found new rooms interesting. He stood before them 4 people who had nothing in common except that they had walked through a door that had no gate, and he understood that what happened in the next hour would establish the terms of everything that followed. "I'm not going to teach you technique today," he said. "Not yet. I want to tell you something first, and I want you to think about whether it's true." He waited until he had the attention of all 4 of them. Thomas, from habit, Maria, from anxiety, David, from a sideways quality of attention that was nonetheless complete, Grace, from genuine interest. Most of us learn early that some things are meant for other people, music specifically. We learn it from schools that cut the program, or parents who can't afford lessons, or teachers who sort students into categories and tell the ones in the wrong category to be realistic. He paused. Everything we're going to do in this room starts from the assumption that that lesson was wrong. Not that you're secretly talented or that you have undiscovered gifts, just that the door was supposed to be open and somebody closed it and we're opening it back up." Thomas looked at his hands. Maria stopped apologizing. David's sideways attention shifted incrementally toward the piano. Grace nodded as though this confirmed something she had always suspected. "Now," Daniel said, "let's find out what you can hear." Voss made his move on a Thursday 3 weeks into the program. Daniel learned about it the way he learned most important things indirectly from someone who had no investment in how the information landed. Ray called him at 6 in the morning on a Thursday to report that his contact in building services at the Meridian had told him that Voss had been at the club on Tuesday night with 2 men Ray recognized as Foundation board members, and that the conversation overheard in fragments by a server who reported to Ray's contact had involved the phrases "unvetted instructor liability exposure" and "what exactly are we funding here?" Daniel sat with his coffee and thought about what Voss was actually afraid of. Not the program. The program had been running for 3 weeks and had 4 students and occupied a narrow stone chapel on West 47th Street, which was not a thing that threatened a man of Voss's standing. What Voss was afraid of was the specific category of embarrassment that occurs when the story of an evening gets told and retold, and the version that survives is the one where he misjudged something profoundly, and everyone who heard the original piano performance knew it. He called Caroline at 7:15. She had already been briefed by her board liaison and was in the process of preparing a response. Her voice had the particular quality it carried when she was operating in crisis management mode, not panicked, not defensive, but moving at the speed of a person who had identified a problem and was already 3 steps into the solution. 2 board members, she said, both older, both with long relationships with Voss. He's framing this as a governance concern. Due diligence on instructors' insurance questions, program oversight. Nothing he says is technically wrong. That's what makes it effective. What do you need from me? Documentation. Every student's name and a brief description of what you're working on with them. Not for Voss, for the 2 board members, so that when I show them what the program is doing, it has faces and stories and isn't just a concept. I'll have it to you by end of day. One more thing. A pause in which he heard her deciding how to frame something. He knows who you are, not just the Gala, the full picture. He made a call to someone at Juilliard. This landed differently than he expected. Not as threat, but as clarification, the thing that had been half legible in the way Voss had looked at him at the Gala, now fully legible. Voss had recognized him not from maintenance work, but from the world they had both briefly occupied 23 years ago, and the recognition had been the specific recognition of a man who had helped close a door once and was now watching it open again. He wrote a review, Daniel said, in 2001. Before the debut, I withdrew from. He called the scheduled performance an interesting experiment in whether raw talent could substitute for cultivated refinement. I read it at the time and decided it was the kind of review that said more about the reviewer than the reviewed. Were you right? I was 23. I thought I was right. Looking back, I think he was describing something real. I was technically exceptional and emotionally guarded in my playing, and he heard that. He just thought the solution was more discipline when the actual solution was more life. He paused. I got the life. I'm not sure he'd consider it a satisfying resolution. Caroline was quiet for a moment. He doesn't need to be satisfied with it. He needs to not have the votes to shut the program down. Another pause. Come to the board meeting on the 15th. Bring your documentation. Let them see you. After the call, he sat for a moment in the chapel with the morning light coming through the cleaned windows and the Yamaha waiting quietly in the center of the room. He thought about Voss, and then he thought about Thomas, who had played 5 notes in a row for the first time last Tuesday with his trembling hands, and had looked at those 5 notes as though he had not expected them to exist. He thought about Maria, who had stopped apologizing midway through the second session, not permanently, but for the 20 minutes during which her whole attention was on the instrument, and those 20 minutes had the quality of 20 minutes in which she was not apologizing to the world for occupying space in it. He thought about David, who had not yet touched the piano, but who had been moving his chair incrementally closer to it, each session a distance of approximately 8 inches per week, and who had told Daniel at the end of the third session that the piano was louder than he'd expected when it was really being played, that it had a kind of— he had paused for a long time, searching for the word, a kind of weight that the recordings didn't prepare you for. He thought about Grace, who had touched the piano in the second session with the tentative curiosity of someone exploring an unfamiliar object, and had played 4 notes of a Gershwin melody with the immediate fluency of muscle memory that had not been touched in decades and had not deteriorated. Her daughter Jennifer had been in the back row for that moment and had turned away before anyone could see her expression, which Daniel understood because he had turned away from a few things like that himself. He opened the notebook on the piano's music desk, looked at the 47 measures of Lily's lullaby. The ending was still not there. He could feel it the way you feel a word you can't quite retrieve, present and slightly out of reach. But it was closer than it had been at 3:47 in the morning in his kitchen the week before. The program, the students, the letters, the work of the past 3 weeks. Something in all of it was composing the conditions under which the ending was going to be findable. He sat down and played through what he had. 47 measures, the same ones that had been waiting for 9 years. At measure 48 he stopped, and the room held the last note until it dissolved. Then he began to improvise forward. He did not find the ending that morning, but for the first time in 9 years he understood that the search was active again, that the piece was not waiting to be remembered, but waiting to be finished, and that finishing it required him to be the person he was now, rather than the person he had been when he set it down. He played for 35 minutes in the empty chapel, and when he stopped, the silence had the quality of a space that had recently been used for something that mattered. He sent Caroline the student documentation at noon. He called Lily at 3:15 when her school day ended. He had dinner ready at 6 when she came through the door with her backpack and her sketchbook and the particular brightness of a child who has had a day worth reporting. Over dinner she told him about a project she was starting, portraits of the chapel students drawn from observation during sessions, each one capturing the person at the piano rather than the person at rest. "Is that okay?" she asked. "To draw them." "Ask them first, every one of them." "Obviously." She considered her plate. "Thomas said yes already. I asked him last Tuesday." "You asked him before you asked me." "I knew he'd say yes. I wasn't sure about you." He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, certain in her instincts, carrying her mother's letters for a year and 4 days, because she understood that timing was a form of love. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." "Good." She opened her sketchbook to a page she had been working on. "Also, I finished the logo." He looked at it. The design was simple. A pair of hands over piano keys, but rendered not as a performance image, but as a listening image, the hands resting rather than playing, present rather than active. In the negative space between the hands and the keys, she had written 2 words. "The listening room." He read it twice. The second time he understood why it was right, not because of what it said about music, but because of what it said about the posture required to receive music, which was also the posture required to receive most things worth receiving. You had to be present. You had to be still. You had to be willing to hear what was actually there rather than what you expected. "That's the name," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I drew it." The recital was scheduled for a Saturday in December, 6 weeks after the program opened, which was either too soon or exactly right, depending on whether you believed that readiness was a condition you arrived at or a decision you made. Daniel had proposed it. Caroline had looked at him across the chapel workbench where they had been reviewing the student documentation and said, with the careful neutrality of someone who was not going to say it was too soon because she had decided to trust his judgment, that 6 weeks was an aggressive timeline. He had said that aggressive was not the same as wrong, and she had written the date in her calendar without further argument. The decision had not come from confidence. It had come from watching Thomas in the 4th session reach the end of a 12-bar phrase he had been working on for 2 weeks and lift his hands from the keys and sit in the silence for a moment with an expression that Daniel had seen on exactly 3 people before in his life, All of them professionals, all of them at the end of performances that had cost them something real. The expression of a person who has said the true thing and is still inhabiting the moment after the saying. Thomas had not known he was making that expression. That was the point. It was not performance. It was the residue of something genuine, and Daniel understood that genuine residue needed an audience before it evaporated back into the ordinary texture of a life, or it would teach the person who generated it that genuine things were only for private rooms. He had gone home that evening and told Lily they were doing a recital. She had looked up from her sketchbook. How many people? Enough that it counts. I'll start on the invitations. He had not asked her what she meant. He had learned across 9 years that when Lily said she would start on something, the appropriate response was to get out of the way. The invitations turned out to be hand-drawn cards 4 by 6 inches, each one individually rendered, not identical prints, but actual drawings. Each one different, each one depicting a specific detail of the chapel that she had observed and recorded over weeks of sitting in sessions with her sketchbook. She made 40 of them. Caroline's assistant had offered to have the design professionally printed, and Lily had looked at her with the specific politeness of someone declining an offer they consider slightly absurd. The cards went to the students' families and to every name on Caroline's foundation contact list that she was willing to invite to something that did not have a press release. Voss received one. This had been Daniel's decision, which he had communicated to Caroline without extensive explanation. She had looked at the card for a moment and then looked at him and said, her voice carrying the weight of someone choosing to extend trust they were not entirely certain was warranted all right. The morning of the recital, Daniel arrived at the chapel at 6:45. The space had been cleaned the previous afternoon and was in the condition it needed to be in chairs arranged in 4 rows of 8. The Yamaha tuned the previous day by the same technician who had tuned it at the program's opening. The windows clear, the lights adjusted to the warm setting that the space required because cold institutional light would undercut everything that was supposed to happen in it. He had ordered this on his own and then told Caroline about it afterward, and she had reviewed the invoice without comment, which he had come to understand was her form of approval. He sat at the piano alone. The chapel was empty except for him and the light coming through the arched windows and the quality of silence that large stone spaces generated, that fuller than ordinary silence that felt inhabited even when nobody was there. He opened the notebook. The ending had come to him at 2 a.m. 3 days earlier. Not through effort, he had been lying in the dark running through the harmonic problem he had been unable to solve for 9 years, the question of where the piece wanted to go in its final measures, and he had understood suddenly that he had been trying to write an ending to a piece that was not finished yet, that the 47 measures he had were the beginning and middle of something that had been waiting not for the right notes, but for the right life. The piece needed the 9 years. It needed Thomas and Maria and David and Grace. It needed Caroline's hand withdrawing from the piano in a ballroom. It needed Lily's letters in a shoebox. It needed all of it because what the piece was actually about was not a lullaby for a child who had not yet been born, but the full arc of what that child's existence had required of the man who wrote it. He played through it once, beginning to end in the empty chapel. 59 measures complete. When he finished, he sat with his hands in his lap and understood that the piece was what it needed to be. He put the notebook in his jacket pocket and began preparing for the day. The board meeting had happened the previous week on a Tuesday in the Foundation's conference room on the 38th floor. Daniel had arrived with a folder containing 1 page for each student, names, backgrounds, what they were working on, what had happened in the sessions. He had not made the pages clinical. He had written them the way you write about people you have spent real time with in the specific rather than the general, because specificity was the only antidote to the abstraction that allowed people like Voss to talk about programs as concepts rather than as the actual humans they contained. Voss had been there. He had come in with the 2 board members he had been working, both men in their late 60s, both with the wary attention of people who had been told something that they were now checking against direct observation. Voss himself had sat at the far end of the table with a stillness that Daniel recognized as the stillness of someone who had prepared a position and was waiting to deploy it. Caroline had opened the meeting with the documentation, the student pages projected on the screen at the end of the room. Thomas Reeves, 63, Desert Storm veteran, tonal nerve damage in both hands, currently working on an original composition using melodic patterns that accommodated his tremor rather than fighting it. Maria Santos, 38, single mother. 2 jobs, learning piano for the first time in her life, had not apologized in session for the past 2 weeks, which was the specific metric that Daniel had recorded because it was the true measure of what was happening. David Park, 17, currently working on an original piece that his instructor described as unlike anything he had heard from a 17-year-old in 30 years of musical engagement. Grace Holloway, 71. Early Alzheimer's, retains complete procedural musical memory, plays Gershwin from muscle memory that the disease had not reached something her neurologist had requested documentation on because it was contributing to research on music memory preservation. Voss had looked at the Grace Holloway page for a long time. When Daniel was asked to speak, Caroline had structured the agenda so that this came after the documentation, after the board had the pictures, before the arguments. He had kept it to 4 minutes. He described what happened in the room on a Tuesday evening when 4 people who had been told in various ways that music was not for them sat down and started to find out whether that was true. He described Thomas's 12-bar phrase and what he had seen on Thomas's face at the end of it. He described Maria playing without apology for 20 consecutive minutes. He described David moving his chair 8 inches closer to the piano each week with the consistency of someone making a decision in very small increments. He did not describe Grace's Gershwin. He let the page speak for itself. When he finished, there was a silence in the conference room that had a different texture than the silence that usually followed presentations in rooms like this one. The 2 board members Voss had been working looked at each other with the slightly uncomfortable expression of people who had arrived prepared to vote one way and were now not entirely sure. Voss had spoken then for the first time in the meeting. He had raised the governance questions, instructor credentials, liability program oversight. His voice had the measured quality of someone making a technical argument they no longer entirely believed in, which was the most dangerous kind because it was harder to argue against than conviction. Daniel had answered each question directly. No teaching certificate, but 23 years of serious musical training and 3 years of working with this specific population. Liability coverage had been in place since the program opened, reviewed by the Foundation's council. Oversight reports monthly to Caroline, available to the board on request. Then he had said something that he had not planned to say, which was the kind of thing that sometimes arrived when he stopped managing a conversation and let it be what it was. Mr. Voss wrote in 2001 that I played with raw talent that hadn't been cultivated into refinement, he said. He was right. I was technically exceptional and emotionally guarded, and that combination produces performances that impress people who are listening for technique and leave everyone else unmoved. He kept his voice even. The 9 years I spent in maintenance work gave me something that Juilliard couldn't. They gave me the specific experience of being in a room full of talented people and not being the one who got to use their talent. That's what my students know. That's why I'm the right person to teach them. Not despite the 9 years. Because of them. The board had voted 4-1 to continue funding. Voss had been the one. It was not the outcome Daniel had hoped for. It was the outcome he had expected. The guests arrived at the chapel in the early December afternoon at 2 o'clock in the December light that came in low and golden through the arched windows that Lily had said 3 weeks ago when she first saw them. In that light looked like the windows in churches in old paintings. The chairs filled in the steady way of an event that people had decided to attend rather than felt obligated to the specific quality of an audience that has chosen to be present. Lily had placed one chair in the front row with a card on it, handwritten in her small, careful script that read, Sarah Holt. She had done this before Daniel arrived and had told him about it afterward with the directness of someone reporting a decision rather than seeking approval. He had stood and looked at the chair for a moment. Then he had walked to the back of the space to check on the cable connection for the small sound system they had set up for the microphone, because looking at the chair required more composure than he had available in that moment, and there were practical things to attend to. Voss arrived at 1:58. He came alone without the board members or the managed context of a formal meeting, and he sat in the third row near the aisle in the way of someone who has not decided yet whether they are staying. He did not speak to Daniel, and Daniel did not approach him. Caroline arrived with her assistant and then sent the assistant to handle the arrival logistics and stood near the back of the space with the particular quality of presence she had when she was not in professional mode, watchful, slightly less compressed, the armor adjusted rather than removed. She had told Daniel the previous Thursday in the chapel at the end of a session that she had played McDowell's To a Wild Rose all the way through in her office the previous Sunday morning. Not for anyone. Just for herself in the empty office with the city outside. She had said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a weather condition, and he had understood that this was the version of a large statement that she was currently capable of making, and had responded accordingly. The students gathered in the small room behind the stage, a former vestry now used for storage, and the occasional pre-performance preparation. Thomas sat with his large hands on his knees, not looking at them. Maria had changed out of her work clothes and was wearing a blue dress that Daniel had not seen before, and that her daughter had told him when she arrived her mother had bought specifically for today. David stood at the window looking out at the street with the quiet internal focus that preceded his best, playing the state in which the outside world was present but not demanding. Grace sat with Jennifer beside her, and Jennifer was holding her mother's hand with the gentle firmness of someone providing an anchor. Daniel stood before them in the vestry, and he did not give them a speech. He had said everything he needed to say over the past 6 weeks in the sessions in the specific work of each person's progress. What he said now was short. Whatever happens out there, what you've done in this room over the past 6 weeks is real. Nobody can take that back. The music you made in here exists even when there's no audience for it. Today, there's an audience, which means other people get to know what you know. That's all a recital is. Thomas looked up from his hands. What if I shake through the whole thing? Then you shake. The shaking is part of you. It doesn't disqualify the music. A pause in the vestry that had the quality of a room in which several people are making a decision simultaneously. Thomas was first. He walked out to the piano with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to commit to movement or not begin it. He sat. He adjusted the bench with the small, careful adjustment that Daniel had taught him, the one that centered his weight correctly and gave his hands the best angle for managing what they were going to do. He placed his trembling hands on the keys. He had titled his piece, Tin Roof Rain. He had told Daniel when he named it that the sound was a memory from his childhood in Georgia, the specific percussion of heavy summer rain on a tin barn roof, a sound from before everything that came after, from the years when his hands were steady, and the loudest thing he had heard was weather. The piece was 12 bars of that memory, rendered in the only language that had turned out to be adequate for it. His hands shook through every note. The music was not technically clean. There were moments where the tremor introduced variations he had not intended, small disruptions in the rhythm that made the piece slightly different from what it had been in practice. It was not diminished by this. It was made more fully itself the shaking part of the voice, rather than interference with the voice, the body's history written into the music rather than erased from it. The audience heard this. Daniel watched them hear it, the slight forward lean of attention, the specific stillness of people who are listening rather than waiting for a performance to end. Thomas's daughter was in the second row. She was trying not to cry with the visible effort of someone who had decided beforehand that she was not going to cry and was now negotiating with a body that had different information. By the final measure, she had stopped negotiating. When Thomas finished, he sat for a moment. Not the performed stillness of a musician, acknowledging an audience, the actual stillness of a man who has just said something he had been carrying for 30 years and is taking a breath before returning to the weight of ordinary time. Then he stood, nodded once at the audience with the abrupt grace of someone unaccustomed to being seen, and walked back to the vestry. Maria went next. She stood at the microphone before sitting at the piano, and she said, "I want to say something. I used to apologize before I played. My teacher told me to stop." A pause. "So I'm not going to apologize. What I'm going to do instead is tell you that I practiced this on a $60 keyboard that I keep under my bed, and I practiced it after my kids were asleep, and I'm not going to tell you I'm nervous because that is not relevant to the music." She sat down. She played. The piece she had chosen was the first complete piece she had learned in the program, a simple melody in C major, 14 bars, nothing technically demanding. She played it with the fierce, unhurried intention of someone who has claimed something and is not interested in performing the claiming, only in doing it. Every note had the quality of a decision, rather than a habit, which was the quality that made the simplest music worth hearing. When she finished, her youngest daughter ran from the third row, 4 years old, entirely unaware of the protocols governing recital audiences, and came to the stage and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "Mommy, that was so pretty." Maria picked her up without standing up from the bench, held her against her chest, and did not try to manage her expression for anyone. David was third. He went to the piano without looking at the audience, with the straight-ahead focus of someone who had decided that eye contact with 24 strangers was not the right preparation for what he was about to do. He sat. He placed his hands, and then he held them there for 5 seconds, without playing, which was not hesitation but calibration, listening to the room, establishing the frequency of the space before introducing his own. The piece he had written did not follow the harmonic conventions that most of the room would have expected. It moved through keys according to a logic that was consistent but not immediately legible, the way certain kinds of order require attention before they reveal their structure. There were passages that felt like interruptions and then resolved into inevitability. There were moments of such concentrated stillness that several people in the audience stopped breathing without noticing. Daniel watched the NYU professor in the 4th row, a woman named Adler, whom Caroline had invited as one of the Foundation's long-standing contacts. She had arrived with the polite expectation of someone attending a student recital and was now sitting with a notepad she had not opened since David began playing, watching with the specific quality of attention that occurs when a person in possession of expertise encounters something that requires them to expand their category. When David finished, he stood and walked back to the vestry in the same straight-ahead way he had approached the piano without acknowledging the applause. Daniel, standing at the side of the room, stepped into the aisle as David passed. David stopped. "Thank you," David said, not quite making eye contact, addressing the middle distance, "for not trying to fix me." "Nothing needed fixing," Daniel said. "You needed space." David considered this for a moment with the honest consideration he gave all statements of fact. Then he nodded once and went back to the vestry. Grace was last among the students, and Jennifer walked her to the piano with the careful attentiveness of someone who has learned to provide support without making the provision of support the visible thing. Today was one of Grace's middle days, not the clear days when she was entirely present, not the hard days when the fog was thick, but the intermediate days when she moved in and out of full awareness with the unpredictability of light through clouds. She sat at the piano and placed her hands on the keys, and in that moment, something happened that Jennifer had described to Daniel on the phone, but that he had not been certain he would see with his own eyes. The uncertainty left Grace's face. Not because she remembered where she was or who was in the room, she might not have been able to say either, but because her hands knew what they were touching, and the knowledge traveled upward from her hands into her expression, and settled it into a focused calm that was entirely unlike the ambient uncertainty of her middle days. She played Gershwin. The melody was clean and exact, phrased with the unhurried authority of someone who had learned this music at a time when her hands and her memory were in full accord and had never let go of it at the cellular level where such things were stored. For 3.5 minutes, she was simply a musician, playing a piece she loved, and the disease that was slowly taking everything else had not reached this room. When she finished, she looked up at the audience with the slight confusion of someone who has been somewhere else and has returned to find more people present than she remembered. She said clearly enough to be heard in the back row, "Did I play well?" Jennifer beside her said, "Yes, Mom, you played beautifully." Grace smiled with the uncomplicated satisfaction of someone receiving information they had hoped for. She said, her voice carrying the room's acoustic. Harold always liked this one. Then she allowed Jennifer to walk her back to her chair in the second row, and she sat with the calm of someone who has completed the thing she came to do. The room was still in the particular way of spaces in which something has happened that requires a moment before ordinary time can resume. Daniel walked to the piano. He adjusted the bench in the way that was now simply the adjustment, the one his body had relearned over the past 6 weeks of daily playing in this room. He looked at the audience. He found Lily in the front row beside the empty chair with Sarah's name on it, her sketchbook open, her pencil stopped. She was not drawing. She was watching him with the complete attention that she had been moving toward all her life, the attention of someone who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. He found Caroline at the back of the room. She was standing rather than sitting, which was unusual for her, and her arms were at her sides rather than crossed or folded, which was also unusual. She looked like someone who has taken off a coat they have been wearing for a long time and is standing in what is underneath it, which is colder and more accurate. He found Voss in the third row. Voss was watching him with an expression that was not the professional assessment of the gala or the managed positioning of the board meeting. It was something more unguarded than either the expression of a man who has spent most of his life evaluating things from a safe distance and has been brought by a sequence of events he did not entirely control into the presence of something that doesn't permit that distance. Daniel spoke without a microphone because the chapel's acoustic did not require amplification if you spoke with enough intention. 6 months ago, I was in this building's cleaning rotation. I want to say that in the past tense, but it doesn't entirely belong there. I still pick up shifts when the program's schedule allows it because the work is honest and I'm good at it, and I'm not interested in pretending that the past 9 years were a detour from my real life. They were my real life. He paused. 9 years ago, my wife Sarah died the night our daughter was born. That night I stopped playing piano. Not because I couldn't, because the music and the loss were the same thing for a long time, and I didn't know how to have one without the other. Lily was very still in the front row. My daughter gave me something recently that her mother had left for me. A letter written before Lily was born when Sarah understood that there were risks and wanted to make sure certain things were said in case she didn't get to say them in person. She told me not to stop playing. She told me that every song is a conversation she gets to hear wherever she is. He looked at the empty chair with Sarah's name on it. I should have listened sooner. I'm listening now. He placed his hands on the keys. This piece is called Lily's Lullaby. I started it before my daughter was born. I finished it 3 days ago. It's for everyone in this room who has set something down and lived long enough to understand what setting it down cost them. He played. The opening was the lullaby he had written for an unborn child, gentle, unhurried, the kind of music that asks nothing of its listener except presence. But it did not stay there. The piece moved through the 9 years, not literally, but in the way that a life informs a piece of music. You could hear in the harmonic progression, the accumulation of something, the specific weight of time that has been lived through rather than over. There were passages of the kind of stillness that occurs when a person is not suppressing feeling, but simply containing it, carrying it, going about the ordinary business of a life with it inside them. The final section was the one he had written 3 days ago, the measures that had required 9 years to become findable. It did not resolve into the simple closure of a traditional lullaby. It resolved into something more accurate, a harmonic landing that acknowledged the loss without being consumed by it, that held grief and continuation in the same chord that said, "This is what it sounds like when someone learns to carry a thing rather than put it down." The last note was a single G played softly, held until it dissolved. The silence lasted longer than usual. This was something he had learned from performing. Silences after music have different lengths depending on what the music is asked of the room, and the longer silences meant the asking had been more complete. Lily stood up. She came to the stage not running but walking with the certainty of someone who knows where they are going. She did not throw her arms around him or cry loudly. She sat beside him on the piano bench and leaned her shoulder against his arm, and they sat together in the dissolving silence, while the room came back to itself. Thomas began to applaud first from his seat in the back, where he had returned after his own performance, his trembling hands making their uneven sound. Maria followed, and her daughter climbed back into her lap and clapped her small hands with the unself-conscious joy of a child who doesn't know she's contributing to something larger than a moment. David was not clapping. He had his eyes closed and his fingers were moving on his thighs in the pattern of Lily's lullaby's final section, transcribing it internally, which was his form of complete reception. Grace was smiling at something only she could see. The room stood. Voss stood with it. He stood in the third row with his hands together, not the measured applause of a man performing approval, but something more effortful. A man who has spent 30 years curating his responses to music and is currently managing the experience of being moved without having chosen to be. His face had the specific quality of someone revising a large structure from a foundational level. The revision was visible, which was something Daniel had not expected to see on that face. He did not seek Voss's eye across the room. He was watching his daughter, who was watching Caroline, who was standing at the back with both hands pressed flat against her sternum and tears on her face that she was making no effort to address, which was for Caroline Mercer the complete surrender of the thing she had been maintaining for 22 years. After the room moved into the small, particular warmth of a gathering that has shared something real and is now navigating the conversation that follows it. Caroline was surrounded by donors with checkbooks and board members with questions, and Adler from NYU who wanted to discuss David Park at length. Thomas stood near the back wall receiving his daughter's embrace with the particular stillness of a large man who has been overwhelmed and is managing it vertically. Maria's children occupied the vestry and had discovered the piano there, which nobody was going to stop them from playing. Voss found Daniel near the side wall when the room was still full enough that their conversation had privacy without isolation. He stopped in front of him and they stood in the noise and warmth of the room, and Voss said, "I was wrong." He said it with the specific economy of someone for whom the sentence cost something and who had decided that embellishing it with justification would reduce rather than increase its accuracy. Not about your technique in 2001, which I stand by, about what technique is for. Daniel looked at him. What changed your mind? Voss was quiet for a moment. The woman with Alzheimer's. He said it simply. My daughter has the same diagnosis. She's 41. I've spent the past year trying to find things that reach her when she's in the hard days. He paused. I didn't know about the music memory research. I'm going to look into it. There was nothing to say to this that would not diminish it. Daniel nodded. The endowment, Voss said. My lawyer will contact the foundation on Monday. Anonymous. I need it to be anonymous. All right. It's not absolution. I know. Voss looked at the piano at Lily sitting on the bench drawing in her sketchbook while the room moved around her. She's very like you, he said, the way she watches things. She's like her mother, Daniel said. I'm still learning from her. Voss left without ceremony, moving through the room with the slightly less armored bearing of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying in a way that hurt. Daniel watched him go and thought about the specific ways that people arrive at what they should have known earlier and how arrival still counted regardless of the route. Caroline reached him when the room had thinned to the families and a few lingering donors. She had recovered the composure that was her working surface, but it was wearing differently now, not like armor, but like the clothing of someone who has been fully themselves in a room and is coming back to the practical requirements of their life without pretending the moment hadn't happened. She stood beside him, and they watched Lily draw. Full funding, she said. 3-year commitment. 2 additional board members who want to talk about replication. A pause. Adler wants to discuss a formal partnership with NYU around David's development. He should have a say in that. Obviously. I told her to reach out directly. Another pause. I played this morning. I know. You told me. I mean, I played something other than McDowell. I played for an hour, in my office alone before anyone arrived. She said this with the careful exactness of someone reporting an event they are still processing the significance of. I didn't think about whether it was good. I just played until I ran out of time. That's what it's supposed to feel like." She was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone who has been given information they already knew and needed to hear from outside themselves. "What happens now?" she said. "For the program. For—" She didn't finish the sentence. He understood the unfinished part. "The program keeps going. We find the next Thomas, the next Maria, the next David." He looked at the empty chair with Sarah's name, which Lily had not yet removed. "And the rest of it." He kept his eyes on the chair for a moment. "My wife's letter said that love doesn't end because the person does. It continues through the things you do with what they gave you." He turned to look at Caroline directly. She was right about most things. Caroline met his eyes with the steadiness of someone who has stopped being afraid of what a direct look might communicate. "She sounds like she was remarkable." She was ordinary in the best way. She was honest and present, and she made the specific claim that the people she loved deserved to be fully seen. He paused. "I've been thinking about that as a standard. It's a high standard. It's the only one that's ever been worth anything." The remaining guests were beginning their leave-taking, the small rituals of coats and goodbyes, and the particular warmth of people who have shared an afternoon that gave them something they'll remember. Lily had moved from the piano bench to the empty chair beside Sarah's card, and she was drawing the room from that position, the full space, the arched windows in the late afternoon light, the piano in the center, the people moving through the gathering warmth of an ending that was also a beginning. Daniel walked over and sat beside her in the chair on the other side of Sarah's card. He looked at what she was drawing. She had rendered the room with the accuracy that she brought to everything she drew, but she had also drawn two figures sitting where they were sitting, him and her, and between them, in the space occupied by Sarah's empty chair, she had sketched something light and indistinct, neither present nor absent. The outline of something that had always been in the room. "That's good," he said. "I know." She didn't look up. "I'm calling this one the listening room. The drawing, I mean, not the name, the actual picture." "Why that title?" She considered the drawing, her pencil hovering. "Because the whole point is that someone is always listening," she said, "even when you think the room is empty." He sat with her in the afternoon light of a December Saturday while the last guests made their goodbyes, and Thomas helped stack chairs with the unhurried competence of a man who had found something useful to do with his hands, and Caroline talked with Adler near the door with the energy of someone whose work had just gotten significantly larger. And Grace sat in the front row with Jennifer the Gershwin still present somewhere in her hands, her face peaceful with the peace of a person who has said what they came to say. Daniel put his arm around Lily's shoulders, and she leaned into him and kept drawing, and the chapel held them all in the particular way that spaces hold the things that happen in them. Not permanently, not perfectly, but long enough to matter, which was all any room could be asked to do. Later, after everyone had gone and the chairs were stacked and Lily had gone home with Caroline's assistant, who had taken on this occasional logistical role with the practical warmth of someone who had come to genuinely care about the people involved, Daniel sat alone at the Yamaha. The light through the arched windows was the last of it, the winter sun having finished its short December arc, leaving the room in the blue-gray quality of early evening. He put the notebook on the music desk and opened it to the final page, the one with the completed ending. He read it through once, then he closed it. He played the piece from memory. All 59 measures, the full arc from the opening lullaby, through the 9 years, through the ending that had required all of it to become findable. He played it in the empty room with the attention of someone doing a thing for its own sake, for the doing of it for the person it had been written for, and the person it had been finished for, and all the people in between. When he finished, he sat in the silence and understood that Sarah had been right. The music was a conversation. It was happening now in this room in the specific acoustic of stone and winter light, and the piano's resonance fading into the walls. It had been happening every time he played, every time Thomas's hands found the 12 bars of Tin Roof Rain, every time Maria's fingers claimed a chord without apology, every time David's music mapped the inside of a mind that the world had been trying to standardize for 17 years. He locked the chapel and walked out into the December evening. The city was doing what the city always did, indifferent to any specific life contained within it, occupied entirely with its own noise and motion and the ongoing business of being the place where 11 million people had decided their lives were happening. He walked toward the subway with his hands in his pockets and the notebook in his jacket, and the full weight of an ordinary evening that had managed, despite all the ways ordinariness resists it, to be exactly what it needed to be. He was not invisible. He had not been invisible for some time now. He had simply been a man learning the difference between moving through the world without being seen and choosing when the time was right to be seen, which was a different practice with a different cost and a different return. He was still learning it. He expected to be learning it for a long time. That seemed about right.